There are moments in history when the veil between what is known and what is hidden feels paper-thin, when a fragment of lost wisdom whispers back into the world and unsettles the foundations of how we see ourselves. Such is the sensation when one encounters the idea of a forgotten Egyptian scroll, a document said to hold instructions on bending reality itself. Not merely a relic, not just a brittle piece of papyrus etched with ink fading like the breath of the Nile at dusk, but a living manuscript in the truest sense, a text that does not sit passively upon a shelf, but one that insists, that demands, to be engaged. It is said that the scroll carried within it not a rigid law, but a fluid art, a weaving of perception and energy that suggested reality is less a fixed stone and more a river awaiting the hands that would shape its flow. To imagine the hands that first inscribed its words is to imagine a people who saw no firm boundary between the divine and the earthly. Ancient Egypt was a place where the seen and unseen were not two domains but a single woven tapestry. The rising sun was not only a celestial event but the rebirth of a god, the flooding Nile not only an ecological necessity but a sacred heartbeat of renewal. Within such a worldview, it is not implausible that wisdom could be recorded in symbolic form, instructing future generations not just in the craft of survival but in the architecture of existence itself. The scroll, whether myth, fragment, or lost treasure, carries this suggestion, that reality is pliable, that the limits we perceive are only the walls of a chamber whose true expanse lies beyond our current sight. The very phrase bending reality can sound, to modern ears, like fantasy, like a conjurer's boast. But here it does not speak of illusions conjured for spectacle. Instead, it speaks of bending perception, attention, belief, the raw fibers of consciousness, from which what we call reality is endlessly woven. To bend reality in this sense is not to defy nature but to harmonize with it more deeply, to attune oneself so precisely to the rhythms beneath appearances that life seems to yield, like reeds bending to the current, rather than resist. The lost scroll, then, becomes not an artifact of arcane trickery but a philosophical mirror. It asks, if the world you live in is partly the projection of your own mind, then how firm are the walls you think contain you? It is no accident that Egypt, with its monumental pyramids and silent temples, remains one of humanity's most potent symbols of mystery. To gaze at the hieroglyphs carved in stone is to be reminded that language itself was once sacred, each symbol not only a letter but a living force. In this context, the scroll becomes more than a text, it becomes a vessel of power, a bridge between word and world. The Egyptians believed that names held essence, that to name a thing was to invoke its energy. Thus, a scroll devoted to bending reality would not merely describe, it would perform. Its words would act like incantations, each line a tool to align inner perception with outer manifestation, each metaphor a key turning in a lock. We live now in a time that prizes certainty, a time of maps, algorithms, and precise instruments. Yet despite our technology, there remains a hunger for the wisdom that lingers just beyond rational reach. The Egyptian scroll enters this hunger like a long-forgotten echo. It reminds us that human beings have always sought more than survival. We have always sought access to the deep script running beneath the surface of events, the script that dictates not only the movement of stars but the shape of our days, our choices, our thoughts. To read such a text today is not to stumble upon a quaint superstition but to recognize that our ancestors, in their mythic language, may have grasped truths that our modern categories can scarcely contain. Consider for a moment the possibility that reality is not unlike a dream shared by billions, a dream shaped by collective belief and reinforced by repeated perception. Within this dream, the scroll whispers, lies the possibility of lucidity. Just as a dreamer, upon realizing they are dreaming, can alter the landscape of the dream, so too can a human being, upon realizing the pliability of perception, bend the reality they inhabit. Not in ways that defy physics, but in ways that transcend the prison of unquestioned assumptions. To bend reality is to discover the plasticity of time, the elasticity of meaning, the responsiveness of events to intention. There is a temptation to dismiss such ideas as mysticism or metaphor only, but perhaps that temptation itself is part of the illusion. What if the boundary between metaphor and reality is thinner than we assume? What if the stories we carry about the nature of existence do not merely reflect reality but participate in its creation? The scroll, lost though it may be, rises like a phantom reminder that what we call the real may be less fixed than our categories of science or reason would have us believe. It suggests that to live is to weave, that consciousness is not a passive observer but an active artisan of the world it perceives. And so the introduction of this exploration is not merely about an ancient Egyptian document but about the timeless longing it represents. It is about the human desire to peer behind the curtain, to reach into the machinery of existence, and to discover that perhaps the machinery is not mechanical at all but musical, not rigid but resonant, a field of vibrations awaiting attunement. The scroll becomes a metaphor, yes, but also a challenge. How deeply are you willing to consider that your thoughts, your emotions, your focus, and your imagination are the very threads from which the tapestry of your reality is constantly spun? Like the Nile, which floods and recedes yet always returns to nourish the land, this wisdom is cyclical. It disappears into the sands of time, only to emerge again when the world is parched for meaning. We are, perhaps, living in such a season now. The scroll reappears not to dazzle us with its strangeness but to remind us of our own forgotten capacities. Its voice is the voice of our ancestors, and perhaps also of our future selves, whispering across the river of time, reality is not a prison, it is clay. Shape it with care. If the introduction of the scroll is like a whisper from antiquity reminding us that reality is clay awaiting the hands of its shapers, then the core of its wisdom lies in the recognition of how that clay may be shaped, and by whom. The Egyptians understood, perhaps more profoundly than we do now, that reality is never a singular, immovable object. It is instead a shifting interplay of perception, belief, rhythm, and symbol. To engage with the scroll is to engage with this interplay, to recognize that what seems fixed is often an echo of deeper patterns, and that by tuning into those patterns, one may bend the trajectory of events, the texture of time, even the substance of self. The first theme that rises from its teachings is that of duality and illusion. The Egyptians, through their mythologies, did not view opposites as enemies but as partners in a dance. Light and darkness, order and chaos, birth and death, each was seen not as a contradiction of the other but as the necessary counterpart without which meaning collapses. Reality, then, was understood not as a single face but as a mask with two eyes, each revealing half the vision. The scroll suggests that to believe too firmly in one half of the mask is to fall into illusion. True power lies not in clinging to light or recoiling from darkness but in learning to stand at the seam, where opposites dissolve into a third perspective. It is here, at this seam, that bending reality becomes possible, because one ceases to be trapped by the linear tug-of-war between extremes. Another guiding concept hidden in the scroll is the primacy of attention. Attention is portrayed not as a passive spotlight, but as the very act of creation. What one gazes upon is not merely observed but infused with energy, drawn from the reservoir of consciousness into form. In this sense, the scroll anticipates what modern physics might describe as the participatory nature of reality, that the observer influences what is observed. But where physics describes it as a faint statistical shimmer, the scroll elevates it to a central law. The world you see is the echo of what you most intently attend to. To bend reality, therefore, is not to command the outer world like a tyrant, but to guide one's attention like a river channeling its current. Interwoven with this is the theme of resonance. The Egyptians spoke often of harmony, of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance. The scroll teaches that reality bends not when one seeks to dominate, but when one finds the resonance between the inner and outer worlds. Like a lyre that vibrates in sympathy with another's string, reality responds to the frequencies we embody. Fear calls forth echoes of fear, gratitude calls forth cascades of abundance, despair reshapes the world into a prison, wonder turns it into a temple. Thus, to bend reality is not to twist it against its will but to join its song so precisely that it shifts to meet you, like a current altering course around the prow of a ship. Time itself emerges in the scroll as less a linear march and more a spiral. For the Egyptians, time was not only chronological but cyclical, infused with seasons of death and rebirth, decay and renewal. The scroll conveys the idea that to bend reality is to step out of the tyranny of linear progression and into the recognition of cycles. In cycles, nothing is truly lost, everything is transformed. What seems like an ending is a seed. To engage with this wisdom is to loosen the grip of urgency, to realize that reality unfolds in rhythms that can be danced with, not deadlines that must be obeyed. Such recognition bends the weight of time itself, turning moments of despair into initiations and moments of waiting into sacred gestation. Another pillar embedded in the scroll is the power of symbols. For the Egyptians, symbols were not arbitrary signs but living vessels. The scarab beetle was not simply a representation of rebirth, it carried the force of rebirth itself. The ink was not just a figure of eternal life, it pulsed with the current of life's unbroken continuity. In this view, the scroll's words and images were never decorative but operative. They worked upon the reader not as information but as transformation. To study the scroll is not merely to read but to be read, to allow the symbols to impress their vibration upon the mind and body until one becomes aligned with their meaning. Thus, bending reality is as much about entering into relationship with living symbols as it is about altering thought or intention. Underlying all these themes is the most radical teaching, that reality is not external to us, but braided through us. We are not witnesses standing apart from the play of the cosmos, but threads in its weaving. The scroll insists that one cannot bend reality without also being bent, that the act of shaping the world simultaneously shapes the shaper. This recognition strips away any temptation to treat the knowledge as mere technique, as though reality were a tool to be manipulated. Instead, it is a call to humility, to reverence, to responsibility. To bend reality is to enter a covenant with it, to recognize that every shift you create reverberates back into the soul that created it. One could dismiss such concepts as poetry, yet it is precisely in their poetic form that they carry their strength. The Egyptians spoke through myth and symbol not because they lacked logic but because they recognized that logic alone cannot hold the fullness of truth. The scroll does not dictate in the language of equations but in the rhythm of stories, images, and metaphors, for reality itself is more story than formula. To bend reality is to enter the myth one is already living, to awaken to the story one is unconsciously telling, and to choose, with awareness, how that story might unfold. In these core themes, duality, attention, resonance, cycles, symbols, and the weaving of self and world, the scroll offers not a set of rigid instructions but a philosophy of existence. It is a philosophy that does not collapse under scrutiny but expands, inviting the reader into a deeper engagement with the world as a pliable, participatory field. It reminds us that what we take to be solid and absolute is in truth malleable, contingent, and alive. The scroll's wisdom insists that the fabric of reality is soft to the touch of consciousness, and that to live without recognizing this is to sleepwalk through a dream one could awaken within. If the core teachings of the scroll were a map of principles, then the symbolic narratives contained within it were the living rivers that gave those principles motion. For the Egyptians, myth was not an idle pastime or the decoration of culture, it was the heartbeat of understanding itself. Through allegory, truths that could not be explained by mere words were carried in story, the way a flame is carried in a lamp. To read these symbolic tales is to enter a theater of cosmic mirrors, where the drama of gods, animals, and elemental forces enacts the very structure of reality. These stories were not only to be told but to be lived, for in their unfolding the listener could glimpse the subtle art of bending the fabric of existence. One of the most striking narratives echoed through the scroll was the story of the god Khepri, the scarab who rolled the sun across the sky. To the modern eye, this might seem quaint, a beetle pushing a sphere. Yet to the Egyptians, it was a profound metaphor for the eternal rebirth of light. The scarab represented not only persistence but the creative act of bringing something out of apparent nothingness, pushing life forward against the inertia of chaos. Within the scroll, Khepri's journey was said to illustrate that reality, too, is not fixed, it must be continually rolled forward by consciousness. Each thought, each act of will, is like the beetle's push, a small effort that in time ensures the great wheel of existence continues its arc. To bend reality is to realize that you, too, are Khepri, rolling the sun of your life through the firmament of experience, capable of guiding its path by intention and by the steadiness of your inner push. Another allegory woven into the scroll involved the goddess Ma'at, the feather of truth, and the weighing of the heart in the hall of judgment. At first glance, this appears as a tale about morality in the afterlife, but within the scroll it becomes something more. The heart, heavy with unexamined fear, doubt, and attachment, binds the soul to a reality dense and immovable. The feather of Ma'at, by contrast, represents alignment with the fundamental order of the cosmos, a life lived in resonance rather than resistance. The allegory suggests that bending reality requires a heart light enough to float, unburdened by the weight of illusion. Only then can perception rise above the rigid gravity of appearances. The story is less about posthumous judgment and more about a daily practice. How light is your heart in this very moment, and what reality does its weight compel you to inhabit? There is also the tale of Isis, who in her mourning and devotion pieced together the shattered body of Osiris. Beyond its mythic drama, this story contains a luminous teaching about the reconstruction of reality. Just as Isis gathered the fragments of Osiris to restore him to life, so too must we gather the fragments of our fractured attention and scattered selves. The scroll portrays Isis not as a figure of mere grief but as the power of focused devotion that reconstitutes what appears broken. To bend reality, the allegory whispers, is to refuse to accept fragmentation as final, to hold with unwavering intention the vision of wholeness until it reforms. In this sense, reality is not shattered irreparably but is always waiting to be reassembled by the healer's gaze, the lover's care, the dreamer's fidelity to possibility. Even the story of the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos who sought to swallow the sun each night, is given a place in the scroll's symbolic theater. Apophis is not vanquished once and for all but is perpetually confronted by Ra and his allies. The allegory suggests that chaos is not a force to be eliminated but an eternal companion to order, a shadow against which the flame of consciousness must constantly be renewed. To bend reality is to accept this rhythm, that resistance and uncertainty will always rise, but they can be navigated, wrestled, and reshaped. Apophis is the test, the reminder that bending reality is not a singular act but a continual dance with disruption, where strength is measured not by eradication but by adaptability. Perhaps the most profound symbolic teaching carried in the scroll is that of the mirror itself. Several passages describe a pool of still water, where the gods gaze and see not merely reflections but new worlds unfolding. This image suggests that reality is like water, reflective, fluid, and responsive to the gaze. When the surface is agitated, the reflection distorts; when it is still, the truth becomes visible. To bend reality is to learn how to still the waters of one's mind, to gaze into the pool not as a distracted observer but as a conscious participant, knowing that the reflection is both revealing and creating. Here, the allegory is as practical as it is mystical. If your inner waters are storm-tossed, the world you see will be fragmented and chaotic. If your inner waters are calm, the world will arrange itself with symmetry and clarity. These symbolic narratives are not meant to be kept at a safe distance, admired like ancient frescoes. They are living metaphors, each one a code waiting to be embodied. The scarab teaches persistence in creating, Ma'at instructs on the weight of truth, Isis reveals the power of devotion to wholeness, Apophis reminds us of the necessity of dancing with chaos, the mirror of the waters shows us how perception shapes existence. Together, they form a constellation of stories that guide the reader into the practical art of bending reality. For in truth, the Egyptians were not teaching a fantasy of defying the laws of nature, but a recognition of how nature herself bends to consciousness. These myths are not fairy tales, they are maps of the inner terrain, descriptions of forces that move through every human life. To encounter them is to recognize oneself, to see in Khepri the persistence required of every dreamer, in Ma'at the delicate balance every heart must find, in Isis the work of mending what is broken, in Apophis the ceaseless challenges we face, and in the mirror pool the truth that reality answers to the quiet depth of our gaze. Thus, the deeper symbolic narratives of the scroll serve as reminders that bending reality is less about control and more about participation. They reveal that we are already living these stories, often unconsciously. The question is not whether we are shaping reality, but how. The scroll, through its myths, insists that by stepping into these archetypal dramas with awareness, we may bend the dream toward harmony rather than chaos, toward renewal rather than decay, toward freedom rather than imprisonment. It is one thing to marvel at the grandeur of symbols and the cosmic resonance of myths, and quite another to ask how such wisdom may seep into the fabric of everyday life. A scroll from ancient Egypt, speaking of bending reality and weaving perception into form, may at first seem too lofty or distant to affect how one rises in the morning, how one works, how one dreams. Yet the genius of this lost knowledge lies in its ability to bridge the monumental and the mundane, the temple and the kitchen, the godly and the human. What good is a philosophy that cannot find its way into the breath and heartbeat of ordinary days? The scroll's power, if taken seriously, is that it insists on this integration, that the bending of reality begins not in palaces of stone but in the soft corridors of thought, in the choices made with each sunrise, in the stillness or turbulence of the inner waters from which one gazes upon the world. Consider the teaching of attention as creation. In practice, this means that the first act of bending reality is the discipline of focus. The modern mind is often pulled in 100 directions at once, scattering its energy like seeds cast into a storm. The scroll whispers that attention is sacred currency, and wherever it flows, reality grows. To integrate this into life is to treat attention as a garden, to water what one wishes to flourish and to starve what one wishes to wither. This does not mean ignoring difficulty, but rather attending to it with the eyes of transformation rather than despair. In the mundane rhythm of a day, bending reality may begin with something as small as where you allow your thoughts to linger, on the endless rehearsals of fear, or on the subtle fragrance of possibility. The allegory of Ma'at and the feather of truth, when brought into lived practice, becomes a continual invitation to lighten the heart. We do not often think of our emotions as architects of the worlds we live in, yet they are precisely that. A heavy heart colors the world in shades of confinement, a heart unburdened reveals paths unseen. To lighten the heart in practice is not to deny sorrow or to paste over grief with shallow affirmations, but to release the clinging, to cultivate forgiveness, to choose alignment with honesty and integrity even when it is difficult. Imagine, then, that each decision you make, each emotion you carry, places a weight upon the scale of your life. To integrate this wisdom is to ask, in every action, does this make my heart lighter, freer, more aligned with truth? If so, reality itself bends more easily, for a light heart floats upon the currents that might otherwise drown the weighted soul. The story of Isis piecing together Osiris becomes deeply practical when applied to the fragmented self of modern living. We are scattered daily, our attention divided, our energies drained, our sense of wholeness fractured by the demands of the world. To live the wisdom of Isis is to practice reassembly. This may mean setting aside time for silence, gathering back the pieces of oneself lost to endless distraction. It may mean giving undivided devotion to a dream or a relationship that feels broken, refusing to believe that fragmentation is final. In practical terms, this becomes an act of fidelity, holding a vision of wholeness even when the pieces are scattered, trusting that through patience and devotion, what was broken can be renewed. The eternal struggle between Ra and Apophis, when lived out in daily practice, reminds us that chaos is not a mistake but a constant companion. Each day brings its own Apophis, unexpected disruptions, fears, resistances, shadows. To bend reality is not to eradicate chaos but to dance with it, to meet it without collapsing into despair. Practically, this may look like the cultivation of resilience, the refusal to let obstacles define the whole of the story. It means understanding that every confrontation with difficulty is also a rehearsal in shaping reality, an opportunity to decide whether the chaos will consume the light or whether the light will rise again tomorrow. The mirror pool of perception perhaps offers the most direct integration of all. In the rush of modern life, it is easy to forget that the world often mirrors back the state of our inner waters. When one's mind is turbulent, even the simplest tasks seem impossible, relationships feel strained, and opportunities vanish into the mist. When one cultivates inner stillness, clarity arises, synchronicities unfold, and reality seems to arrange itself in surprising harmony. To practice this wisdom is to make space for stillness each day, to breathe, to quiet the restless surface, to gaze inward with care. This is not idle meditation, but the very art of shaping the reflection the world offers. In practical life, then, the bending of reality looks less like spectacle and more like subtle shifts. It is the choice to carry lightness instead of heaviness, presence instead of distraction, trust instead of fear. It is the discipline of treating attention as sacred, of remembering that symbols are alive and that stories are more than entertainment, they are the blueprints by which we unconsciously live. Even work, relationships, health, and creativity can be reframed through this lens. The project you struggle with is not only a task but a fragment awaiting reassembly. The relationship in conflict is not only difficulty but the presence of Apophis, inviting you to wrestle with chaos and find renewal. The health of the body is not only biology but a mirror of the harmony, or disharmony, within. To live this way is to accept that the scroll was never about esoteric ritual alone, but about the continual art of presence. Reality bends not once in a dramatic act but continually, in each gesture of awareness, each act of intention, each willingness to live symbolically rather than mechanically. The world becomes less a cage and more a canvas, less a fixed prison and more a pliant river. By living with this awareness, even the ordinary becomes luminous, a conversation becomes a spell, a thought becomes a seed, a decision becomes a turning of the cosmic wheel. Perhaps the most practical integration of all is the recognition of responsibility. To bend reality is not merely to enjoy the benefits of influence, but to shoulder the weight of co-creation. Every word spoken, every thought cultivated, every emotion carried is part of the weave. To live in awareness of this is to treat life with reverence, to realize that each of us is already bending reality with every breath, whether consciously or not. The scroll's gift is not to give us the ability to bend reality, but to remind us that we are already doing so, and to call us to do it with intention, with integrity, with awe. If we have journeyed thus far through the corridors of the scroll's wisdom, past the introduction that unveiled its mystery, through the principles that undergird its vision, into the allegories that breathed it alive, and finally into the quiet places where it enters daily life, then the conclusion is not a closing, but a beginning. For the scroll, whether it exists in stone and papyrus or only in the echo of our collective longing, is not a relic to be admired but a threshold to be crossed. Its teachings are less about knowledge than about transformation, less about observing than about awakening. To speak of bending reality is, in truth, to speak of bending ourselves, of softening the rigid shell of assumption until the malleable, living truth of existence can shine through. The scroll's deepest message is that reality is not a wall but a mirror. We have spent so much of our lives pressing our hands against this wall, lamenting its hardness, cursing its resistance. Yet the scroll asks us to pause, to look again, and to notice that the wall glimmers faintly. It reflects us. It moves in response to our gestures, our breath, our unspoken stories. What we thought immovable is in fact pliant, and what we assumed external is braided into our own consciousness. The prison bars we saw are, upon closer inspection, lines in the sand, drawn by belief, sustained by habit, ready to be redrawn by awareness. This is not to say that the bending of reality is without discipline, nor that it occurs without cost. To awaken to this pliability is also to awaken to responsibility. If the world is responsive, then every thought becomes a seed, every word a spell, every gesture a ripple. We are no longer permitted the comfort of believing ourselves powerless, for to claim powerlessness is to abdicate the artistry of life. The scroll calls us instead to maturity, to recognize that freedom and responsibility are the two wings of the same bird, and that to fly we must embrace both. To bend reality is to co-create with it, and co-creation is always a sacred act, demanding humility, reverence, and care. The transformational call of the scroll is therefore not a call to domination, but to alignment. The ancients knew that to force reality is to break oneself against it, but to resonate with reality is to ride its currents with ease. The scarab rolling the sun does not rage against the sky, it simply persists. The feather of Ma'at does not fight to be weightless, it simply is. Isis does not despair at fragments, she gathers them in devotion. Ra does not eradicate chaos, he confronts it anew each night. The mirror pool does not impose reflection, it offers it in stillness. To live these truths is to enter into harmony with the patterns beneath appearances, to cease demanding that life conform to the narrow confines of fear, and to open oneself to the greater design that responds to wonder, attention, and trust. In practical terms, the call is simple but profound: awaken. Awaken to the weight you carry in your heart, and lighten it where you can. Awaken to the fragments of yourself scattered across distractions, and gather them back into wholeness. Awaken to the chaos that greets you each day, and face it not as an enemy to destroy but as a companion to navigate. Awaken to the mirror of the world, and calm your inner waters so that what you see may be clear. Awaken to the fact that your attention is the loom upon which reality is woven, and that each moment of awareness is a thread in the great tapestry. When we accept this call, something subtle but unmistakable shifts. Life ceases to be a series of obstacles endured and becomes instead a field of possibilities shaped. Suffering is not erased, but it is no longer meaningless, it becomes initiation. Joy is no longer fleeting, but becomes a reminder of resonance. Choices are no longer accidents, but declarations that ripple outward. The scroll's ancient voice, though faint across millennia, becomes unmistakable within the heart. You are not merely living in reality, you are reality living itself through you. And to recognize this is to step into the role of conscious participant in the cosmic play. The true bending of reality, then, is not spectacle, it is presence. It is not about commanding mountains to move, but about discovering that mountains and self are made of the same dream stuff, shifting together in unseen ways. It is not about performing miracles for astonishment, but about recognizing that the miracle has always been here, that breath is miracle, that awareness is miracle, that the simple act of shifting attention from despair to hope can alter the entire shape of a day, and by extension, a life. The transformational call is this: live as if reality is pliant, because it is. Live as if your thoughts matter, because they do. Live as if your heart is weighed in each moment, because it is. Live as if your stories are alive, because they are shaping you even now. Live as if the sacred symbols of the past still breathe, because they do, waiting for you to embody them once again. Live as if your life is the scroll itself, written line by line in the ink of your choices, carried forward across time as a testament to what you believed was possible. And above all, live with reverence. For to bend reality is not to play God in arrogance, but to walk as a co-creator in humility. It is to touch the fabric of existence with care, to shape with love rather than fear, to align with harmony rather than force. In this way, each of us becomes the scarab, the feather, the healer, the mirror. Each of us becomes the continuation of the scroll, its wisdom no longer hidden in sand or temple walls but inscribed in the living manuscript of humanity's unfolding story. The ancient Egyptians may have lost this scroll to time, but perhaps it was never truly lost. Perhaps it waits in the recesses of memory, in the symbols we still carry, in the myths that still breathe, in the longing that still burns within us to shape our lives as art rather than accident. To answer its call is to awaken to that longing and to honor it, not tomorrow, not in theory, but here, now, in the choices that bend your reality with every passing moment. Thus, the conclusion is not an end but a threshold. The scroll is spoken, and now it falls to us to respond, not with passive admiration but with active transformation. The call is simple yet infinite: awaken, align, create, revere. For the reality you inhabit is waiting, pliant as clay, alive as water, ready to bend in the direction of your deepest truth.